For those of us who are a long way from the tropics, diseases such as malaria are normally a distant threat or holiday worry. But now there are growing concerns that hotter summers like the one we've just had are bringing it all much closer to home, and not just malaria, other killers too. This is Roundtable. I'm David Foster. The names are lurid: chikungunya, Vibrio, West Nile virus, to name just a few. And it's not just the heat that makes them feel more at home here. It's because we travel more, trade more, and bring them back with us. Unwelcome visitors, are they here to stay?
Climate change is causing temperatures to rise, allowing mosquitoes, ticks and fleas to move into new areas. Could they bring diseases with them? And is the world ready to deal with this looming threat? Wet weather and high temperatures. This year's global heatwave was the ideal environment for many lethal organisms. In warm, damp conditions, mosquitoes have the perfect breeding ground. But drought can also increase breeding, with mosquitoes attracted to water stored in domestic containers. A higher population of mosquitoes means there's growing potential for epidemics. This year, EU member states reported 710 cases of West Nile fever by the end of August. Italy, Greece, Romania and Hungary have the highest rates. In the United States, the number of people who've contracted diseases transmitted by mosquito, ticks and flea bites more than tripled from 2004 to 2016. And experts are worried about whether the population can cope with the introduction of new viruses.
There's no immunity at all in the population. And secondly, there are lots of mosquitoes and the right sorts of mosquitoes in South America, and so once the virus got into that population, it could spread very rapidly.
With increased global travel, some experts fear people could become more exposed to tropical diseases. But scientists are working on new models to predict future epidemics. If they succeed, it could help public health bodies prepare for outbreaks. As the climate changes, disease-carrying organisms could soon spread beyond their current natural habitats. Could we see parts of the world facing new diseases usually reserved for tropical climates? And are authorities ready for this possible threat?
Let us start talking, let us start learning. Joining us via Skype from Stockholm, we have Professor Jan Semenza, Head of Scientific Assessment at the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control from Barcelona. We have Dr. Rachel Lowe from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, working specifically, I believe, in Spain on climate change. Here at the Roundtable, we have Professor Chris Drakeley, also from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and Alan Fenwick, who's from the School of Public Health at Imperial Universities. Thank you very much for joining us. Jan, if I can come to you first of all, I read something you wrote in one of the UK's national newspapers saying we're all a bit taken aback about how fast these changes are coming down the pipeline. Does that mean we should be a bit worried?
This particular quote refers to the West Nile fever outbreak that we're currently experiencing in the southeastern part of Europe. This particular outbreak was 3 to 4 times more intense than anything we have experienced before. As you mentioned in your video clip, there are 700 cases so far. The most extreme year in the past has been like 400 cases. So we are above the normal. In fact, those cases have occurred faster than any time before. They appeared more quickly. And so we are taken aback by the quick emergence of this particular West Nile fever outbreak in southeastern part of Europe. Should we be worried? Potentially, yes, I think so.
And worried for what reason?
Because a lot of these individuals that are infected with Nile fever, they are asymptomatic. That means that they don't experience any particular symptoms, which means that they might go and give blood at the blood supply, and that donation can then potentially contaminate the blood supply and impact many more people. So because West Nile is asymptomatic in a lot of people, in 80% of the cases, that potentially causes a threat to the blood supply and has implications for all of us.
I mean, it's a very common phenomena in certain things like malaria. And what it essentially means is that you need to have appropriate diagnostics that enable you to be able to say what a person has and to be able to screen those products before they might go into the community. And what we want to be able to do is have something that allows us like a multiplex approach to screen multiple things simultaneously. So we need that technological advancement. People aren't going to come to be screened unless they think there's something wrong. How would you spot that there's a potential for that? I think that's very important from the work that we're kind of hearing about, is having appropriate surveillance networks established, and those being people responding to those surveillance networks. So they are not necessarily coming to us, but having the health systems prepared if people do come in. Okay, Rachel, to you now. You're looking specifically at the effect of climate change on public health with your work there in Barcelona. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, in general, climate defines the geographical and seasonal limits of infectious diseases. So if we start to see changes in the climate, so more warmer conditions, more extreme events, then we can expect to find more habitats suitable for mosquitoes that transmit these diseases. We can also see a change in human behaviour. So recently we conducted a study in Barbados where we were looking at the risk of dengue, and we found an interesting relationship with drought conditions resulting in a higher risk of dengue several months later. And we believe this is to do with the way people are storing water, and this is having the unintended consequence of providing additional breeding sites for the Aedes aegypti mosquitoes.
So these are naturally, not all of them, I'm sure, that they like fresh water rather than salt water. So if it is your drinking water that you're storing in times of drought, it's going to be pretty much impossible to make sure that you don't attract mosquitoes, I would have thought, Rachel.
Absolutely. So the Aedes aegypti is particularly an urban mosquito, and it favours breeding in and around the home. So it's crucial to keep these areas clear of potential breeding sites, which can be very difficult, particularly in slum areas where you have lots of discarded rubbish, you have areas that are not well served without access to piped water. So really, we need to be making sure that communities have access to clean water and that any water storage containers are at least covered and well maintained.
The Aedes aegypti, Alan, is the one I think we heard a lot about when Zika made the headline.
That's correct. Yes.
So tell me a little bit about the dangers we face. Okay, let's talk about mosquitoes rather than other insects.
I'm much more interested in telling you about parasites, but there is no doubt that malaria is a parasite.
Give me 30 seconds on the mosquito in this case.
There are two factors, really. The first factor is temperature. Obviously, the mosquito carries a number of different diseases, different mosquitoes do. But there is a temperature needed for the parasite inside the mosquito to develop. The higher the temperature, the faster it will develop. If it doesn't develop fast enough, then the mosquito will die before it becomes infective. So I think that's one factor. The other factor is the breeding of the mosquito itself. Water has been mentioned. Temperature is also important, and also the actual the hygiene situation in people's homes. I think all these taken together will affect whether or not there are more mosquitoes and more infected mosquitoes.
Let me ask you about temperature, and we'll get on to the hygiene in just a moment, because this is a question I want to ask you about developed countries such as the UK, whether we need to worry because we're relatively clean. But if you have extremes in terms of high temperatures, but you also have, as we had last winter, very, very low temperatures, then this is just a temporary problem, I'm guessing, because they would die. Therefore, they're not going to be around forever. The next lot have to come in.
Many people don't even think about it, but I often do. Where do these creatures go in the winter? Why don't they die off and never come back? They do have a mechanism of survival, and they can travel much further distances than we think. And so once we get the temperature high enough in the UK, those insects will come. Whether they will come and bring disease, that's another question, and one possibly that Chris can address, because there are very few people carrying malaria in the UK. Very few.
All right, I'll come to you in a moment, Chris. But yeah, in terms of the concerns that we have, Alan's just raised one that I wasn't aware of, which is that these creatures can effectively hibernate during the winter and they can travel, because I've always read that we had to bring them in either on planes or in our luggage or something like that, but they can migrate, can they?
These mosquitoes do in fact expand in Europe right now as we speak. One of them is called Aedes albopictus. It was imported into Italy, into Geneva and Venice in the 90s, and it has been expanding ever since. It is basically now all over the Italian peninsula, in the southern part of France and part of Spain, in the Mediterranean basically, and they can travel. When it gets blistering cold, what they do, they go into sewer lines and hide in warm environments, and then the next seasons they're back out again doing their thing. So these mosquitoes are here to stay. Once they have established themselves in an environment, it's virtually impossible to get them away, get rid of them. We might be able to control the population, but eliminating them is very, very difficult.
How do you prevent them coming in the first place?
They arrived in Europe on a big ship that came from Georgia, from the Atlanta area in the United States, in used tires. Because as you know, in tires, there is always standing water that accumulates during a rain event. And then the mosquitoes lay their eggs in those tires and they travel long distances. And when they arrive in Rotterdam or in Geneva or a harbor, they hatch and occupy that ecological niche that is unoccupied, and that's where they spread.
Wow. Chris, do you want to jump in at this particular point with something that Alan said or something that Jan said?
Yeah,
I've got a question for Rachel in a moment.
Okay, I mean, that movement of mosquitoes and vectors of disease, you know, it can be also...
So what does one mean by vectors of disease? Because I've read a bit about this quite a lot.
So we've focused on mosquitoes, but there are other species of insects. Somebody mentioned ticks in the build-up, and other sort of
get on to parasites,
arthropod vectors, and Alan, I have to mention
vectors is a disease-carrying creature.
It's the intermediate step between us and the illness, so it might carry that. And I think, you know, we see actually in certain parts of Africa mosquitoes being carried on seasonal winds and moved several hundred kilometres. And that's not just mosquitoes; it's other insects and other things being moved. So it can happen, even with the kind of very specific example that we heard there. But we should also remember that we've had, in the UK, we've had malaria-carrying mosquitoes for centuries. Shakespeare wrote about it, Chaucer wrote about it. They're in Epping Forest. So the fact is, as Alan mentioned, we don't have the people with the disease to manifest that transmission. And it's once we start having those people, potentially these asymptomatic carriers coming in, that we really need to be beefing up our kind of surveillance to be able to monitor disease transmission.
One of the questions that our producer put to each and every one of you was do you think there is a correlation between climate change and what we're seeing at the particular moment? I think you said you actually don't think there is a correlation. Rachel, I'd like to hear what Chris says and then get your response.
I think part of the problem is it's so multifactorial. We talked a lot about movement, and it's almost, if you look at the movement increase, even in just the last 10 years, it's an astronomical increase. So people, products moving around. There is this, what is undoubtedly a slow rise in sort of average mean global temperatures, whether that has happened at the same rate that we see the increase in kind of disease. I just think it's very difficult to disentangle.
So if you had gone back to 1976, which was the summer that's always quoted as being on a par with the summer we've just seen here, you would not have seen, because there wasn't so much travel, perhaps, as many cases as we're seeing now.
Probably, but I would also say we probably don't actually have the diagnostics to have a look at. We didn't then make that certain. So we're better at looking, we're moving more, and we have a climate change phenomenon happening, and so it's just quite difficult to attribute directly to one thing.
Okay, well, you can either address this to Rachel or I can throw it
Please, you do.
Which is that it's because we get around more, because we trade more. It's not necessarily because we're pumping too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
Well, the travel and the trade provides ideal opportunities for both people and mosquitoes to bring diseases into previously unaffected areas. And if at the same time we have increasingly suitable climate conditions, we can have longer transmission seasons, and we have a greater probability of an outbreak being established, having the combination of infected travellers returning to, say, a city in Europe where the Aedes albopictus mosquitoes are present. So it's a combination of all these things, and along with other factors such as population density, the services that are provided to particularly vulnerable communities, which can make them less protected and allow these diseases to spread. And as Jan and Chris mentioned, these asymptomatic cases cause a real complication to be able to track and monitor these diseases.
Which of course leads us to migration.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, that's a great question. We analyzed exactly that question. So at the European CDC, we conduct epidemic intelligence, which means that we monitor all the outbreaks that happen throughout Europe. And we analyzed every single epidemic event that we have experienced in Europe. And we asked the question, what were the underlying drivers, determinants, risk factors for that particular event? And as Rachel just mentioned earlier, the one driver, the one cause that came at the top was in fact travel and tourism. So that was the biggest driver of all these epidemic events that we are experiencing in Europe. Then we have food and water system breakdowns. We have natural environment. We have global trade and climate. Those are the 5 top when it comes to the emergence of these infectious diseases. So it's not either or, it's not just climate change, it's not just globalization, it's a combination of factors that need to be, that act in concert in order to precipitate these kind of events that we are seeing today.
Okay.
So global travel and tourism is the biggest one, but climate contributes, and that's how it works. It's not either or, it's also.
Alan, you wanted to bring parasites into this.
Well, yes, I did, because
in terms of scientific.
From a scientific point of view, Chris mentioned vectors, and the vector is the carrier in a way. With many of the parasitic diseases, if you were infected, you could not infect me. We have to go through an intermediate host or a vector. The one disease which has spread into Europe surprisingly, or surprised a lot of the scientists in recent years, has been schistosomiasis or bilharzia. Now, the vector of this particular disease is a freshwater snail, and the freshwater snails are all over the place. But the schistosomiasis has a specific snail, and suddenly, 4 or 5 years ago, tourists from Germany and France who went to Corsica came home with urinary schistosomiasis, which was a total surprise. We'd never known that transmission took place.
So are you saying these
Europe.
snails somehow had got?
No, I'm saying that the snail was living in conditions and fulfilled 2 conditions. One, that the temperature was warm enough for the parasite to develop in the snail. And secondly, there were people who were urinating in rivers and therefore infecting the snails. And it turns out that DNA analysis has shown that the particular source of this one infection was from Senegal. And so people traveling, again, your point, Jan, the people traveling to Corsica, to France, from Senegal were carrying that parasite in their bodies and then infecting the intermediate hosts.
Does this mean, and this was my question going to be about hygiene, that in developed countries, which I mentioned earlier, obviously there's less likelihood of unsanitary conditions. But does this mean that there's very little you can do to avoid it if that sort of thing is happening? Temperatures are rising and people are peeing in the river, which
exactly.
they're going to.
I mean, you can have as many toilets as you like, but if you've got tourists going in the water, there is going to be some urine and stool which will reach the water, and the eggs are being excreted from the human body in the stool and urine, and they will hatch and infect snails if snails happen to be there. If the temperature is warm enough, and this is what's happened in Corsica for the first time, then the development takes place and the water becomes infective to people who are swimming.
But this isn't a Jaws moment, is it? You know, just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water.
Well, who knows? It may happen a little bit further up. It may happen in France. It may happen in Spain. And it may go, it depends just what the temperature is. But no, we're talking about Mediterranean countries and we're talking about fresh water.
Okay, now I'm sitting here getting more and more scared, and we haven't even got into the Asian tiger and ticks and all that sort of thing. But I'm sure if you feel like mentioning them, then please do. But I want to get on to how prepared are we, Jan and Rachel, first of all, how prepared are we to be able to negate the likelihood of these diseases spreading? What is the prevention system like?
That's a good question. That's a good question. We did, in fact, ask that question, and we did a survey of all the European state epidemiologists, and we asked them, do you think we are prepared when it comes to climate change and infectious diseases? And only 5 out of those experts from countries thought that they were prepared. A lot of our surveillance systems are suboptimal. They don't really capture the potential changes that are now happening throughout the world due to globalization and due to climate and all that. We are doing everything we can trying to improve the surveillance systems on the European continent, and we are trying to monitor not only the diseases, but also these particular vectors that are involved in the transmission of the disease. So we have a network of entomologists, people that love insects, that go out and monitor different environments to see if they see invasive mosquito species, like the tiger mosquito that you mentioned, Aedes albopictus, and other mosquitoes that could potentially be a threat to humans. And once we have a handle of where those high-risk areas are, then we can go into those areas and alert the public health professionals that this is a high-risk area. You need to look out for cases. You need to get out with messages to the public. You need to do everything you can to prevent an outbreak from spreading if it happens.
You see, a magazine called Ecology, I was reading just as a layman, seems to be suggesting that the projected models that you have at the moment are not necessarily up to speed.
I don't deny the fact that this is a very difficult task. For example, for West Nile, we have the transmission in mosquitoes that transmits the birds, and then it jumps over to humans. So it's a very complicated disease, and it's a very difficult thing to model. If we look at other diseases such as Vibrio, we at European CDC have developed a very good system where we monitor sea surface temperature in marine environments that we use as predictor for environmental suitability for these Vibrio infections. And guess what? These Vibrio infections have the same case fatality rate as pathogens like Ebola or whatnot. They're very dangerous. They can give you wound infections and diarrhea and things like that that can be very hazardous to health. And we monitor the environmental conditions, the sea surface temperature, that then can predict the environmental suitability in those waters for these infections. And then we can say, you need to stop bathing, you need to keep elderly, immunocompromised or susceptible individuals out of the water because this is a high-risk area. So there are certain things we can do, but I don't deny the fact that this is difficult.
But perhaps progress is being made, and this is where we're going to round it all up. Rachel, if I could come to you first of all. I mean, dealing with this on a daily basis and seeing the effect that climate change has and the distress that these diseases can cause, it must be quite difficult to remain cheerful, but perhaps it's headlines like this one I read: World Health Organization hails major progress on tackling tropical diseases. Do you think things are being done? Is it an exciting time?
Well, I can give you a local example from Barcelona that when reported cases, infected travellers report at the hospital in Barcelona, the vector control teams then move into the household where that patient is and then try and eliminate the mosquitoes that could be breeding around that patient. So that's a very sort of active surveillance situation. There are challenges to that because not everyone will allow mosquito teams to access their private property. There are also challenges to do with education because not everyone in Europe is aware of the risks of contracting these diseases, either travelling or locally. So I think it's really a case of improving education in general about how individuals can protect themselves, how communities can keep their households cleaner and free from mosquitoes. And in terms of how we can help solve this problem, we are working to try and integrate things like climate forecasts to help us try and predict when and where epidemics might occur. So we're really moving towards trying to integrate environmental monitoring and climate prediction with disease surveillance to try and improve our early warning system.
Chris, and then I'll ask Alan to wrap it all up for us.
Yeah. So, I mean, I mentioned before that the causes were multifaceted, and I think the solutions have to be exactly that way. I mean, we've already heard some of the climate modelling, some of the predictions that we can use, enhancing the surveillance, getting community engagement, actually, if you think about either crowdsourcing children to go and catch mosquitoes, which is what they've been doing in Australia for Aedes mosquitoes, setting out little traps, things like that.
But there are billions of these creatures. What's a little jam jar going to do?
If billions of people do it, or if thousands of people do it, then I think that's where you get to. And also, if it's a small impact. I think of it as the kind of Red Queen scenario from Alice in Wonderland, that the background is moving and we've got to run to stay in the same place. And that's what happens. I mean, the bird situation that Jan describes is amazing. A number of these infections have zoonotic elements, so there's an animal host as well, and it's so difficult to predict those. Some of the others are a little bit more predictable. The niches of Allen snails are very particular, so we know where they might occur, but other things we don't know.
Reasons to be cheerful, or have we just got to live with this and get better at dealing with it?
I don't think that there will be more than a tiny creep at the moment.
A creep of what? Progress or a creep of...
No, a creep of infections going from the tropics to Europe. The headline, I think, just is worth mentioning there. I don't know whether you can read my badge of, it says 1 billion. 1 billion people living in the tropics were treated free of charge against neglected tropical diseases last year, with drugs that were donated by the pharmaceutical company. That's what that headline is all about. But the moving and the climate change is going to cause a shift, because we're going to have more of this where it's gone dry and more of that where it's gone wet.
Be vigilant, I think, is the answer here. And if you see the headlines, look behind it for the science as well. Jan, Rachel, thank you very much indeed. Chris, Alan, thank you for coming on, and thank you for watching. I do hope you can sleep tonight, and I hope that you've enjoyed the programme. Roundtable with me, David Foster. Back next time. See you then. Bye-bye.